The fluorescent lights of the chapel hummed with a low, steady buzz, a sound that seemed to vibrate right in the center of David's chest. He sat in the front row, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his knuckles white from the pressure. He couldn't look at the casket. It was covered in a spray of white lilies, their scent so thick and sweet it almost choked him. Instead, he focused on the pattern of the carpet, a swirling mix of beige and gray that seemed to go on forever. It was a strange thing to notice at a time like this, but his mind was grasping for anything to hold on to, anything that wasn't the crushing weight of the silence in the room. The room was full. That was the one thing David could be grateful for. Every single metal folding chair was occupied, and people were standing along the back wall, shifting their weight from foot to foot. They had come for Eleanor. They had come because Eleanor Higgins was the kind of woman who left a mark on you, a scratch on your heart that didn't heal over, but simply became a part of who you were. She had been a librarian at the local elementary school for 40 years. She hadn't just checked out books. She had checked on the kids. She knew who was hungry, who was sad, and who needed a quiet place to hide from the noise of the world. David looked over his shoulder, scanning the faces. He saw Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who lived downstairs, dabbing her eyes with crumpled tissue. He saw a group of young teachers, women Eleanor had mentored, holding on to each other like they were afraid of drifting away. It was a sea of gray hair and black coats, a somber crowd united by one thing. They had all been loved by the woman in the casket. But as David looked back toward the front, his eyes drifted to the chair directly to his left. It was empty. A flush of anger, hot and sharp, shot through his veins. He looked at that empty vinyl seat and felt a resentment that surprised him. He knew it wasn't rational. He knew that funerals were chaotic and that people got stuck in traffic or got the times wrong. But this wasn't just anyone. This seat was saved for a specific reason, a reason that had consumed David for the last 2 weeks. He thought back to the stack of letters he had found in his mother's shoebox. They were old, the paper yellowed and brittle, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The return addresses were from places like Toronto, New York, and later, Los Angeles. The handwriting on the envelopes was messy, hurried, but the words inside were careful. They were letters from a young man who had nothing but a dream and a hunger. They were letters from Keanu. David had grown up knowing the story. His mother didn't talk about it to everyone, but in the quiet of the kitchen, while she was making tea, she would tell David about the winter of 1984. It had been a brutal year for the theater group. Funding had dried up, and the heating in the old community hall was spotty at best. Eleanor was a volunteer coordinator, a young woman with a fierce belief that art could save souls. There was a kid in the group, a gangly teenager with shaggy hair and eyes that looked like they had seen a lifetime of hurt already. He was talented, but he was barely scraping by. He didn't have a coat, David. Eleanor had told him once, her voice soft with memory. He wore that thin leather jacket everywhere, even when the snow was piling up on the sidewalks. I used to make extra sandwiches for the cast, just so I could slip him one without him feeling like a charity case. The memory made David's throat tight. His mother had a way of doing that, caring for people without asking for anything in return. She had taken that young actor under her wing, letting him crash on the Higgins pull-out couch when the heat in his basement apartment was shut off. She had read lines with him until 3 a.m, fueling him with cheap coffee and endless encouragement. She had told him, time and time again, that he had a light inside him that the world needed to see. And then he had made it. He had left Toronto and become a name that everyone knew. He became an action star, a heartthrob, a cultural icon. But through it all, he had written to Eleanor, short notes at first, then longer reflections. He never forgot the sandwiches. He never forgot the couch. 2 weeks ago, when Eleanor's breathing had become shallow and the hospice nurse had started speaking in hushed tones about comfort care, David had made a decision. He found an address online, an agency in California that represented the star. He sat by his mother's bedside, listening to the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine, and he typed out a letter on his phone. It felt futile, like sending a message in a bottle across an ocean. But he had to try. "Dear Mr. Reeves," he had typed, his thumbs shaking. "I don't know if you remember Eleanor Higgins from Toronto. She is my mother. She is passing away. She speaks of you often. It would mean the world to her if you knew." He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a signed photo. He just wanted the man to know. He sent it to the general inquiry email address. He waited. He checked his inbox every hour, praying for a reply. Days passed. Then a week. Eleanor's condition worsened. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes whispering lines from Shakespeare, sometimes asking David if he had fed the cat. On the night she died, the phone had remained silent. No call, no email. David had sat in the hospice room for hours after her heart monitor had flatlined, staring at the black screen of his phone, feeling foolish for expecting anything else. The world was big, and his mother was just a librarian from a small town. Why would a superstar stop his life for her? Now, sitting in the funeral home, the reality of it settled on David like a heavy blanket. People were just people. Memories faded. Hollywood was a million miles away from this quiet room with its humming lights and beige carpet. He felt a pang of embarrassment for the empty chair. It looked dramatic, a glaring gap in the front row. People were probably wondering who was missing. They were probably thinking that David was being presumptuous, leaving a seat for a ghost. The director, a tall man with a sympathetic smile and a suit that was slightly too big for his shoulders, walked over to the podium. He tapped the microphone, sending a sharp squeal through the speakers that made everyone wince. "We are going to begin in just a moment," the director said softly. His eyes flickered to the empty chair, then to David. He gave a small, pitying nod. It was a look that said, "Asterisk, I understand." "It's okay, asterisk." David hated that look. It made him feel small. He wanted to stand up and explain. He wanted to tell the room that his mother had helped raise a legend. He wanted to prove that her kindness had mattered, that the seed she planted had grown into something massive. But the proof was missing. The proof was somewhere on a movie set or on a beach or in a mansion, living a life that had nothing to do with a drafty theater hall in Toronto. A woman in the second row leaned forward and gently touched David's elbow. It was Mrs. Albright, a retired teacher who had been Eleanor's best friend for 30 years. "Are we waiting for anyone, dear?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. David swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to go away. He looked at the empty chair, then at the casket, then back at his hands. "No," David whispered back, his voice cracking. "No, I don't think we are." He felt a tear finally break free and roll down his cheek. It wasn't just the grief anymore. It was the disappointment. It was a realization that the world moved on, and sometimes the people you saved didn't come back to save you. His mother had asked for nothing, but David had wanted this one thing for her. He had wanted her to see that her investment had paid off, that the boy she fed was a man who remembered. The music started playing through the overhead speakers, a soft, instrumental version of a song Eleanor used to hum while she gardened. It was time. The director signaled for everyone to stand. David stood up on shaky legs. He looked at the glass doors at the back of the room. Through the glass, he could see the parking lot. The sun was bright, reflecting off the windshields of the cars. It was a beautiful day, clear and crisp, the kind of day Eleanor loved. But the doors remained closed. The vestibule was empty. David turned his back to the door. He faced the casket, the flowers, the weeping crowd. He took a deep breath and tried to compose himself. He had a eulogy to give. He had to be strong, just like Eleanor had taught him. He had to speak about the sandwiches and the theater and the kindness, even if the only person who truly understood the magnitude of it wasn't there to hear it. "Thank you all for coming," the director began, his voice booming slightly in the quiet room. "We are here to celebrate the life of a remarkable woman." David tuned it out. He focused on a single point on the wooden podium. He mentally rehearsed his own speech, the words he had scribbled on a napkin that morning, because he couldn't find the right notepad. He would talk about her laugh. He would talk about her famous apple pie. He would keep it light. He wouldn't mention the letters. He wouldn't mention the empty chair. He would bury that disappointment deep down inside, right next to grief. Outside, a bird chirped loudly, the sound cutting through the glass. It was a sharp, cheerful noise that felt out of place in the gloom of the chapel. David closed his eyes for a second, wishing he was anywhere else, wishing he didn't feel this bitter sting of letdown on top of his heartbreak. The director was finishing his opening remarks. "And now," he said, gesturing toward the first row. "Eleanor's son, David, would like to say a few words." David stood up. He smoothed the front of his black pants. He felt 100 eyes on him, watching, waiting, offering their silent support. He took a step toward the aisle, preparing to walk up to the podium. He was ready to do his duty as a son. He didn't look back. He didn't see the glass doors at the rear of the room slide open. He didn't see the figure step inside. Squinting slightly as the bright light from the parking lot faded into the softer fluorescent glow of the chapel, he didn't see the man in the simple, dark suit who stood silently at the back, his head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him. David was too busy trying to hold himself together. He reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and unfolded the crumpled napkin with his notes. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw Mrs. Gable. He saw Mrs. Albright. He saw the empty chair to his left, a stinging reminder of his failed hope. "My mother," David began, his voice trembling, "was the kind of person who noticed things." He paused, clearing his throat. He wanted to say more, but the words were stuck. He looked at the empty chair again, and for a moment, he almost broke. He almost let the anger show. But then a strange feeling washed over him, a shift in the air pressure. The hum of the lights seemed to change pitch. Someone in the back row gasped. It was a sharp, sudden intake of breath. Then another person nudged their neighbor. A low murmur began to ripple through the crowd, starting from the back and moving forward like a wave. David frowned. He looked up from his notes. He scanned the crowd, confused by the sudden distraction. People weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking past him toward the entrance. David turned around, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He expected to see an usher's or maybe a late relative who had gotten lost on the way. He did not expect to see the glass doors slide open and the bright glare of the afternoon sun silhouette a tall figure in the doorway. For a moment, the light was too bright to make out details. The figure stood there, a dark shape against the white light of the parking lot. Then the doors hissed shut, and the shape stepped forward into the cool, recycled air of the chapel. A collective intake of breath seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. It wasn't a gasp of fear, but pure, unadulterated shock. It was the sound of a room full of people having their realities shifted in a split second. The man stood near the entrance, holding a pair of dark sunglasses in one hand. He was wearing a suit, but it wasn't the sharp, tailored, expensive-looking suit you see on movie premieres. It was a simple, dark gray suit that looked a little loose on his frame, like maybe he had lost weight recently, or maybe he just didn't care about the fit as much as he cared about being respectful. His hair was dark, pulled back into a neat ponytail at the base of his neck. His face was unshaven, covered in a salt and pepper stubble that made him look tired, human, and surprisingly vulnerable. There was no entourage. There were no bodyguards with wires in their ears scanning the room for threats. There were no flashing cameras or reporters shouting questions. It was just him. Keanu Reeves had walked into a small-town funeral home on a Tuesday afternoon. David felt his knees go weak. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning an even paler shade of white. He blinked, sure that his grief was playing tricks on him, that his mind had conjured this image out of desperation and lack of sleep. But when he opened his eyes, the man was still there. Keanu didn't stride in with the confidence of an action hero. He moved with a quiet, hesitant grace. He looked down at the floor for a moment, as if checking to make sure his shoes weren't squeaking on the linoleum. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, a nervous, self-conscious gesture that seemed entirely out of place for a global icon. He wasn't looking for attention. In fact, he seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible, which was a difficult task for a man who was well over 6 feet tall and instantly recognizable to every single person in the room. The silence in the chapel was heavy. It wasn't just a silence of respect for the dead anymore. It was a silence of awe. The woman in the second row, Mrs. Albright, dropped her tissue. It fluttered to the floor like a white flag. A young man standing against the back wall nearly dropped his phone, fumbling to catch it before it hit the ground with a clatter. Keanu flinched slightly at the sound of the dropped phone. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room. They weren't the eyes of a movie star posing for a poster. They were deep, dark eyes that held a weight of their own. They looked sad, not the performed sadness of a red carpet memorial, but a deep, personal, bone-weary sadness. He didn't wave. He didn't offer a charming smile for crowd. He simply nodded once, a small, tight dip of his chin, acknowledging the room without demanding attention. Then, his gaze traveled down the center aisle. It passed over the rows of shocked neighbors and former students. It passed over the flower arrangements and the hymnals tucked into the backs of the chairs. It landed on David. David felt a jolt of electricity run through him. He felt exposed. He was standing up there, the grieving son, his face a mess of tears and confusion, and this man, this superstar, was looking right at him. David wanted to say something, to acknowledge the miracle that was happening in front of him, but his throat was dry. He couldn't make a sound. Keanu didn't look away. He held David's gaze for a long, uncomfortable second. In that look, David saw something he didn't expect. He didn't see pity. He didn't see the polite, distant sympathy of a stranger. He saw recognition. It was a look that said, asterisk, I know what you lost. I know who she was. Asterisk. Keanu began to walk down the aisle. The crowd parted instinctively, though there was plenty of space. He moved slowly, his steps measured and quiet. As he passed the rows of people, heads turned, following his progress. Whispers started to break out, a low buzz of static that filled the silence. Asterisk, is that him? It can't be. But look at his eyes. It is. It's really him. Asterisk. David watched him approach. The anger he had felt just moments ago, the bitter resentment at the empty chair, the feeling of being forgotten, evaporated instantly, replaced by a swirling mix of shock and relief. He hadn't come for the fame. He hadn't come for the press. He had come for her. When Keanu reached the front row, he stopped. He looked at the empty chair next to where David had been sitting. He looked at the small laminated sign taped to the back of the seat that read, reserved. He didn't sit down immediately. He turned toward the casket. He stood there for a moment, his hands clasped in front of him, looking at the spray of white lilies. He closed his eyes. His lips moved slightly, whispering something too quiet for anyone else to hear. It was a private prayer, a private goodbye. It felt intrusive to watch him, like witnessing a secret moment through a keyhole. David stepped down from the podium, his legs feeling like jelly. He approached Keanu cautiously, half afraid the man would vanish in the thin air like a mirage. Mr. Reeves? David managed to whisper. His voice cracked on the second word. Keanu opened his eyes and turned to David. He was much taller up close. He smelled like cigarette smoke and fresh air, a strange, earthy combination. I'm sorry I'm late, Keanu said. His voice was low and raspy, the exact voice David had heard in 100 movies, but stripped of all the bravado. It was just a voice, a human voice. The flight was delayed, and the traffic on the expressway was bad. I didn't want to interrupt. David stared at him, his mouth slightly open. You came, he said stupidly. I sent the email, but I didn't think. Keanu offered a small, sad smile. It didn't reach his eyes, but it softened the hard lines of his face. I got the message, he said softly. I could not come. Not for Eleanor. Hearing him say his mother's name, asterisk Eleanor asterisk, sent a fresh wave of tears spilling down David's cheeks. It sounded different coming from Keanu's lips. It sounded like a memory. She talked about you all the time, David stammered, wiping his face with the back of his hand. She worried about you. She wondered if you were happy. Keanu looked down at the floor again, shuffling his feet. He looked uncomfortable with the praise, but he didn't pull away. She was good to me, he said quietly. When I didn't have much, she made sure I had a place to go. She made sure I felt seen. The director of the funeral home was standing off to the side, looking utterly bewildered. He glanced at his watch, then at the clock on the wall, clearly unsure how to proceed with the service now that a celebrity had hijacked the proceedings. Would you like to sit? David asked, gesturing to the empty chair. Keanu nodded. Thank you. He sat down in the chair that had been the source of so much of David's anxiety. He didn't take up more space than necessary. He sat with his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, looking for all the world like just another mourner. But of course he wasn't. He was a magnet for every eye in the room. David walked back to the podium. He felt a strange new energy coursing through him. The sadness was still there, heavy and aching, but the loneliness was gone. He wasn't the only one carrying the weight of Eleanor's memory anymore. He had backup. He looked out at the crowd. They were still staring, their necks craned, their mouths agape. David realized that the dynamic of the room had shifted. It wasn't a small, sad gathering anymore. It was something historic. It was a story they would tell their grandchildren. But David didn't care about the story. He cared about the man sitting in the chair next to his mother's casket. "I was about to give a eulogy," David said into the microphone, his voice gaining a little strength. "But I think we need a moment." He stepped back on the podium again and looked at Keanu. "Do you want to see her?" David asked. It was an impulsive question. He didn't know the protocol for this. Was it weird to ask a movie star to view the body? But Keanu hadn't come to sit in a chair. He had come to say goodbye. Keanu looked up at David, surprise flickering in his eyes. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "I would like that." David motioned for him to follow. Keanu stood up, and the room held its breath. He walked a few steps toward the casket. David stood back, giving him space. Keanu approached the edge of the open casket. He looked down at Eleanor Higgins. She looked peaceful, her hands folded over a rosary, her gray hair styled perfectly. She looked like a librarian, a mother, a friend. She didn't look like the woman who had shaped a star. Keanu stared at her for a long time. He didn't cry. He didn't break down. He just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. Then he reached out a hand. He didn't touch her skin. He gently touched the edge of the silk lining of the casket, a gesture of connection and respect. "Thank you," Keanu whispered, so quietly that David almost missed it. "Thank you for sandwiches." He stood there for another minute, the silence stretching out, heavy and profound. The crowd didn't fidget. They didn't whisper. They watched, sensing that they were witnessing something deeply private and incredibly rare. They were witnessing a moment where the walls between the real world and the world of make-believe dissolved. Finally, Keanu took a deep breath and stepped back. He turned to David. There was a shift in his demeanor. The hesitation was gone. He looked ready. He looked like he was there for a purpose. "David," Keanu said, "I would like to speak, if that's okay." David blinked. You wanna say something?" Keanu nodded. "I have some things I need to say. About your mother. About who she was. Not the librarian. Not the neighbor. But the person who saved my life." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The funeral director looked like he was about to faint. The crowd leaned forward in their seats. David felt a sob rise in his throat, but this time it wasn't a sob of pain. It was a sob of gratitude. "Yes," David said, his voice trembling. Please tell us." Keanu walked toward the podium. David stepped aside, offering him the floor. As Keanu passed, he paused and put a hand on David's shoulder. It was a firm, warm grip, a transfer of strength. "You did good, kid," Keanu said softly. "You did good getting a hold of me. I'm glad you did." Then Keanu stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted the height, lowering it slightly. He looked out at the sea of stunned faces. He didn't look like a celebrity anymore. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a grave, remembering the person who had pulled him back from the brink. He took a breath, the sound loud in the microphone, and began to speak. Keanu stood behind the podium, his hands gripping the wooden sides. He looked down at the microphone, then out at the sea of faces staring back at him. The room was deadly silent. You could hear the low hum of the air conditioning vents, the shifting of feet on the carpet, and the erratic breathing of David standing just a few feet away. He didn't start speaking right away. He took a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the glare of the spotlight. He looked uncomfortable, his shoulders slightly hunched, like a boy standing in front of principal's office, not a movie star dressing crowd. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, catchy in his throat. "I'm not good at this," he said quietly. "I'm not good at saying goodbye." A few people in the audience nodded. It was such an honest, human thing to say. It stripped away all the glamour instantly. Keanu looked down at his hands, then over at the casket. "I've been to a lot of places in my life," he continued, his voice gaining a little strength. "I've seen a lot of things. But standing here right now, this is the hardest place I've ever been." He cleared his throat and looked directly at David. "David invited me here. And for a second, I wasn't sure if I should come. Not because I didn't want to, but because sometimes memories hurt. Sometimes remembering the good times hurts even more than remembering the bad, because you know those times are gone." He shifted his weight, looking down at the floor before looking back up. "I want to tell you a story. It's about a winter in Toronto, a long time ago." The room leaned in. This was what they were waiting for, not a performance, but a glimpse behind the curtain. "I was a kid," Keanu said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "I was 17, maybe 18. I thought I knew everything. I thought I could take on the world. But the truth was, I was cold, I was hungry, and I was scared." He gestured vaguely with one hand. "I was doing this play. It was Shakespeare. Hamlet. We were performing in this old community hall. The heating was broken, or maybe the landlord just didn't want to pay for it. I don't know, but I remember the cold. It was a cold that got into your bones. I had this jacket, a leather jacket that I thought made me look cool, but it had holes in the lining. The wind just cut right through it." He paused, the memory playing clearly in his mind. "I didn't have money for food. I was too proud to ask for help. I would go to rehearsals and try to act like everything was fine. I would say my lines. I would swing the plastic sword around, and then I would go sleep in a basement apartment that had no heat. I was fading away. I was angry at the world." Then Keanu's face softened. His eyes seemed to look past the crowd, focusing on a spot in the distance. And then there was Eleanor. The name hung in the air, sacred and heavy. She wasn't just a librarian, Keanu said. She wasn't just the one who checked the books out. She was the one who watched. She saw things that other people didn't see. He mimicked holding something in his hands. One night, after rehearsal, I was packing up my bag. I was starving. My stomach was hurting so bad, I couldn't stand up straight. Eleanor walked over to me. She didn't ask me if I was hungry. She didn't ask me for my life story. She just handed me a paper bag. Keanu's voice dropped to a whisper. Inside that bag was a sandwich, ham and cheese, and an apple, and a thermos of hot tea. He looked at David. "David, do you know why she did that?" David shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He had heard the sandwich story before, but never like this. Never from the mouth of the man who ate it. "She did it because she knew I wouldn't take charity," Keanu said. She said, "Keanu, I made too much dinner tonight. My eyes were bigger than my stomach. I can't let this go to waste. You'd be doing me a favor." A small laugh, broken and sad, escaped Keanu's throat. It wasn't leftovers. It was fresh. She cut the apple into slices. She knew I didn't have a knife. She thought of everything. The audience was mesmerized. The image of the global superstar as a starving teenager, accepting a sliced apple from a kind woman, was a picture no camera had ever captured. "She fed me for months," Keanu said, his voice trembling. "Every rehearsal, a sandwich, a soup, sometimes a piece of cake she accidentally bought too much of. She never asked for a thank you. She never asked for a ticket to my movies later. She just wanted me to eat." He looked down at his hands again, clasping them tightly together. "But she gave me more than food. One night, I was sitting on the stage steps. I was ready to quit. I thought, this is stupid. I'm freezing. I'm broke. I'm going nowhere. I was crying. I thought no one could see me." Keanu took a shaky breath. Eleanor sat down next to me. She didn't tell me it was going to be okay. She didn't lie. She just put her arm around my shoulder. She smelled like old books and vanilla. She told me, "Keanu, the world is going to break your heart. That's a promise. But it's also going to show you beauty. You have to stick around to see which one wins." He looked out the crowd, tears now glistening in his own eyes. I didn't understand what she meant then. I was too young. But I understand now, because I'm standing here and my heart is broken. But I'm also looking at all of you, and I see the beauty. He gestured to the room. "Look at this room. Look at how many people came to sit in a cold room, and cry for a woman who made sandwiches for a kid who had nothing. That is the beauty she was talking about. Keanu wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a raw, unpolished gesture. Eleanor didn't just save my body. She saved my dream. She told me I had a light. She told me I was worth something when I felt like I was worth nothing. I have done a lot of movies. I've been on big sets. I've traveled the world. But the best performance I ever gave, the best thing I ever did, was showing up for those rehearsals, because it meant I got to see her smile. It meant I got to be in the presence of a truly good person. He looked directly at the casket now, speaking to Eleanor as if she were sitting right there in the front row. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cracking, "I kept the promise. I stuck around. I saw the beauty. Thank you. Thank you for sandwiches. Thank you for the couch. Thank you for seeing the boy behind the leather jacket." He stepped back from the microphone. Overcome, he lowered his head, taking a moment to compose himself. The room sat in stunned, respectful silence. No one moved. No one coughed. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room and replaced with something heavier, something profound. David stood frozen by his seat. He felt a hand on his arm. It was Mrs. Albright. She was weeping openly, clutching his sleeve. She knew, Mrs. Albright whispered hoarsely. She always said he was special, not because he was famous. She said he had a good heart. David nodded, unable to speak. He looked at Keanu, who was now taking a sip of water from a glass on the podium, his hand shaking slightly. It was such a simple human action. It broke David's heart and healed it at the same time. The director of the funeral home finally stepped forward, looking emotional himself. He patted Keanu on the shoulder gently, a silent signal that the floor was his for as long as he needed. Keanu nodded at the director, then looked back at David. He walked away from the podium and crossed a short distance to where David was standing. He didn't try to hug him immediately. He just stood in front of David, looking him in the eye. "I didn't get to say goodbye to my mom," Keanu said softly, so only David and the people in the front row could hear. "I know what it feels like, that empty spot in your chest. It doesn't go away, but it changes. It becomes a place where you keep them." David looked up at the taller man. "She loved you," he whispered. "She really did." "I know," Keanu said gently. "And I loved her." He reached into his jacket pocket then. The movement was slow, deliberate. The outline of part 2 had mentioned a book, and now the audience watched, holding their breath, wondering what else this man had brought with him across the continent. Keanu pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was old, the corners worn smooth, the spine cracked from years of opening and closing. The cover was a dark, faded green. "This was hers," Keanu said. "She lent it to me that winter. She said, 'Read this. It will teach you about words.' It was my first real acting book." He held it out to David. "I stole it," Keanu admitted, a hint of a mischievous smile touching his lips for a second. "I never gave it back. I kept it in my trailer for 30 years. Every time I had a hard scene or I felt lost, I would open it up and read a few lines. It felt like she was there, guiding me." David took the book. It was warm from being close to Keanu's chest. He opened the cover. On the inside page, in fading blue ink, was the inscription. Asterisk for Keanu. "Words have power. Use yours well. Love, Eleanor." Asterisk. David ran his thumb over the handwriting. It was a tangible piece of his mother, returned to him by a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. "I wanted to bring it home," Keanu said. "It belongs here." The gesture was small, quiet. It wasn't a check for $1 million. It wasn't a statue. It was a returned library book. And in that moment, it was the most expensive gift David had ever received. "Thank you," David whispered, clutching the book to his chest. Keanu nodded. He looked around the room one last time, acknowledging the people who had come to mourn. He didn't seem like a star anymore. He just seemed like a guy who was tired and sad and full of love for a woman who had made him a sandwich 30 years ago. "Is there anything else I can do?" Keanu asked David quietly. David looked at the casket. He looked at the flowers. He looked at the stunned faces of his neighbors. "Just stay," David said. "Just stay until the end." Keanu nodded. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. I'm right here." He turned and walked back to the empty chair. He sat down, right next to the spot where David was standing. He crossed his legs, placed his hands in his lap, and looked forward at the minister who was preparing to finish the service. He was just a man in a chair. But for the first time all day, the empty space in the room didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full. The minister finished the final prayer, his voice echoing slightly off the low ceiling of the chapel. It was a standard prayer, one of those generic blessings that ask for peace and comfort, but today it felt different. Today, the words seemed to land with actual weight because of the silence that followed them. Usually, at this point in a funeral, there was a shuffling of feet, a quiet murmur of people preparing to leave, the click of purses being opened and coats being retrieved. But not today. Today, the room stayed perfectly still. David stood up from his chair, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He looked at the casket, then at the crowd, and finally at the man sitting to his left. Keanu hadn't moved. He sat with his head slightly bowed, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, looking for all the world like he was deep in thought, or maybe just lost in a time that wasn't this one. He didn't jump up to leave. He didn't check his phone. He just sat there, holding the space for David, the funeral director, a man who usually moved with the efficient, practiced speed of someone trying to keep a schedule, seemed unsure of himself. He looked at David, then at Keanu, then back at the exit. He didn't want to be the one to tell the movie star it was time to go. But Keanu sensed a shift. He stood up slowly, unfolding his tall frame from the folding chair. He adjusted his jacket, pulling the hem straight, and turned to David. "Take your time," Keanu said quietly. His voice was rough, stripped raw from the eulogy he had just given. "Don't rush on my account." The organist began to play the recessional music. It was a soft, sad piece that David recognized but couldn't name. It was a cue for the family to leave. David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to walk past all those staring eyes. He had to lead his mother out of this room for the last time. He felt a wave of dizziness, the blood rushing to his head. He swayed slightly. Before he could even stumble, a hand was there. It wasn't the director's hand, which was hovering uncertainly nearby. It was Keanu's. He didn't grab David. He just placed a firm, steady hand on David's upper back, right between the shoulder blades. It was a grounding touch, a silent transfer of strength. "I've got you," Keanu whispered, leaning down close to David's ear. "Just breathe, one step at a time." They began to walk. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. As David walked down the aisle, Keanu walked right beside him, not ahead, not behind, but matching his pace exactly. It was a remarkable sight. The grieving son, dressed in a suit he had bought off the rack, and the Hollywood star, dressed in his simple clothes, walking shoulder to shoulder. It didn't look like a photo op. It looked like two soldiers walking off a battlefield together. They reached the back of the room. The glass doors slid open automatically, letting in a rush of fresh, cool air. The sun was bright outside, blindingly so, a sharp contrast to the dim, hushed atmosphere of the chapel. David stepped out onto the sidewalk. The parking lot was full of cars, glinting in the afternoon light. The hearse was waiting, a long, black shape that looked too shiny for a day like this. The pallbearers were standing near the back of the vehicle. They were neighbors and friends, men David had known his whole life. They looked nervous. They were staring at Keanu. Usually, pallbearers are focused on the weight of the casket, the grip of the handles, the mechanics of not dropping someone's loved one. But today, they were distracted. They were looking at the face of the man who had played Neo and John Wick, standing in a church parking lot in a wrinkled suit. David felt a flash of annoyance. He wanted to tell them to look away, to focus on his mother. But before he could say anything, Keanu walked past him. He didn't head toward a waiting car or a corner to hide in. He walked straight toward the hearse. David stopped and watched. He saw Keanu approach Mr. Henderson, an older man with a bad back who had volunteered to help carry the flowers. Mr. Henderson was struggling with a massive arrangement of white hydrangeas. It was heavy, the water sloshing around in the oasis foam, the stems thick and unwieldy. Mr. Henderson was sweating, his face red from the exertion. Without a word, Keanu reached out. He didn't wave for an assistant. He didn't ask for permission. He just grabbed the heavy ceramic base of the flower arrangement with both hands. "Let me help you with that," Keanu said. His voice was low and calm. Mr. Henderson blinked, startled. He looked like he might drop the flowers in shock. "Oh, Mr. Reeves, you don't have to." "It's heavy," Keanu said simply. He bent his knees, lifted the arrangement, and settled it against his chest, protecting the petals with his chin. "Show me where it goes." The funeral director stood by the open door of the hearse, his mouth slightly open. He had probably overseen 1,000 funerals, but he had never seen a A-list celebrity doing manual labor. Keanu walked past him and carefully slid the flower arrangement into the back of the hearse, maneuvering around the casket with practiced ease, making sure not a single petal was crushed. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants. He didn't look at the crowd that was now gathering on the sidewalk, whispering behind their hands. He looked at the next load. There were boxes of memorial cards, a few framed photos, and another heavy wreath. David walked over, his heart pounding. "You don't have to do this," he said, feeling a desperate need to protect Keanu's dignity, or maybe just his own sanity. "You're a guest." Keanu turned to him. He squinted slightly in the bright sunlight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather-bound book he had shown David earlier. He held it up, the green cover catching the light. "I told you, David," Keanu said softly. "I stole this from her. I owe her, and I owe you." He put the book away and reached for the heavy wreath. It was made of dark red roses, thorny and dense. The thorns poked through the plastic wrapping. Keanu didn't flinch. He grabbed it, his fingers getting pricked by the sharp spines, and lifted it. A tiny drop of blood appeared on his thumb. He didn't wipe it off. He just carried the wreath to the car. The crowd watched in stunned silence. This was the unbelievable part. It wasn't that he showed up. Anyone can show up. It was that he was working. He was part of the crew. He was refusing to be a VIP. Once the hearse was loaded, the driver walked around to open the door for David. David got into the back seat of the family car, his mother's sister, Aunt Pat, climbing in beside him. Aunt Pat was crying quietly into a handkerchief. She hadn't seemed to notice Keanu yet, lost in her own fog of grief. Keanu stood by the curb. He didn't get into the family car. There wasn't room, and it wasn't his place. He stood there, watching David roll up the window. The driver of David's car, a young guy who clearly knew who was standing on the sidewalk, looked nervous. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror. "Who is that?" Aunt Pat whispered. Finally looking up, she squinted through the glass. "Is that the actor? The one from the bus movie?" David nodded. He couldn't speak. He just looked at Keanu standing there on the pavement, alone now. The wind ruffled Keanu's hair. He had his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the breeze. He looked lonely. "He came for Mom," David managed to say. Aunt Pat gasped. "Eleanor loved him like a son," she said, her voice trembling. "She wrote him letters every Christmas. She never heard back." She heard back. David said, thinking of the book, the inscription, the look in Keanu's eyes. "She just didn't tell us." The car began to pull away. David turned around in his seat, looking out the back window. He expected to see Keanu climbing into a limousine or a sleek sports car. That's what stars do. They make an appearance. They say their piece, and then they vanish back into their golden lives. But that isn't what happened. About 50 yards behind the hearse, parked in the far corner of the lot where no one would notice it, was a motorcycle. It wasn't a flashy, chrome-covered chopper. It was a beat-up, matte black Norton. It looked like it had seen 1,000 miles of hard road. Keanu walked toward the bike. He didn't take his suit jacket off. He just swung a leg over the machine and pulled a helmet out of a compartment. He put the helmet on, covering that famous face. David watched as Keanu kicked the engine to life. It roared a low, guttural sound that cut through the quiet afternoon. And then he fell in line. He didn't zoom past them. He didn't race ahead. He rode behind procession, keeping a respectful distance, his body leaning into the turns as the funeral train wound its way through the streets toward the cemetery, to the people in the other cars. It must have been a strange sight. A long line of cars with flags on the hoods, followed by a solitary man on a motorcycle, riding slowly, deliberately. He was the rear guard. He was a lone rider, escorting Eleanor Higgins to her final rest. David watched him in the side mirror until they turned a corner, and Keanu disappeared from view for a moment, only to reappear a few seconds later, steady and true. Aunt Pat reached over and squeezed David's hand. "She would have liked that," she whispered. "The motorcycle. She always liked the rebellious ones." David let out a wet laugh, the first real laugh he had managed in days. "Yeah," he said, wiping his eyes. She really did. The drive to the cemetery was short, but it felt long. David stared out the window at the passing houses. The trees just starting to turn colors for autumn. He thought about the empty chair in the chapel. It wasn't empty anymore. It had been filled by a man who carried grief like a heavy stone in his pocket. A man who understood that showing up is easy, but staying is hard. They arrived at the cemetery. The ground was green and manicured, the headstones standing in neat rows like silent soldiers. The car stopped. David took a deep breath. He had to do the hardest part now. He had to watch them lower her into the ground. He stepped out of the car. The air was cooler here, under the shade of the big oak trees. The wind whispered through the leaves, a soft, rustling sound. He heard the motorcycle engine cut out. David looked back. Keanu parked the bike on the grass, off to the side. He took off his helmet and shook his hair out. He didn't fix it. He looked tired, his face pale in the dappled light. He walked over to the group gathering around the tent. He stood at the back again, just like he had in the chapel. He didn't try to push his way to the front. He didn't seek out the family. He just stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, watching, waiting. The priest was there, a different man than the one from the funeral home. He read the committal prayers. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. David watched the casket. He felt the world narrowing down to just that box. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp ache in the center of his chest. And then he felt a hand on his shoulder again. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. He didn't need to see the face. He just needed the presence. Keanu stood right behind him, just off to the side. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to fix it. He just stood there, a silent sentinel, making sure David didn't have to fall alone. As the service ended, and the workers prepared to lower the casket, the crowd began to disperse. People came up to David, hugging him, shaking his hand, murmuring condolences. They whispered about Keanu, glancing at him nervously, but no one dared to approach him. He had an aura around him that said, "Give me space. I am working." When the last of the mourners had moved away toward their cars, heading to the reception hall, David was left standing alone by the grave. He wasn't ready to leave yet. He wanted to stay a little longer. He wanted to apologize to her for not being more successful, for not giving her the grand life she deserved, for all the times he had been impatient. He stood there, tears running down his face, talking to the ground. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." He felt a hand on his arm. He turned. Keanu was standing there, holding out a single white lily. It must have fallen off one of the arrangements during the transport, or maybe it picked it up. It didn't matter. "She knows," Keanu said softly. He held the flower out to David. "She knew." David took the flower. He looked at Keanu, really looked at him. He saw the lines on his face, the gray in his beard, the sadness in his eyes that mirrored his own. "How do you do it?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you keep going when it hurts this much?" Keanu looked down at the grave, then up at the sky. He took a deep breath. "You carry them," Keanu said. He pointed to his chest. "In here. And when it gets too heavy, you let someone else help you carry it for a while." He put his hand on David's shoulder again, squeezing firmly. "I'm going to the reception," Keanu said. "I'll ride with you, if you want." David nodded. He didn't trust his voice. "Come on," Keanu said gently. "Let's get out of the wind." They walked together, away from the grave, toward the cars. David felt lighter. The pain was still there, a sharp edge in his heart, but he wasn't carrying the whole weight of it alone anymore. He had a partner. He had a friend. He had the boy his mother saved, standing ready to save him. The reception was held in the basement of the church, a large room with low ceilings and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low, steady hum. The walls were painted a pale yellow, covered in bulletin boards announcing bake sales and community potlucks. It smelled of strong coffee, instant tea, and the sweet, heavy scent of glazed ham. It was a room meant for laughter and gossip, for knitting circles and Boy Scout meetings. But today it felt like a waiting room for hearts that were broken. David stood near the door, greeting people as they came down the stairs. He felt like he was running on autopilot. His hand ached from shaking so many hands. His face hurt from the polite, tight smile he'd been wearing for hours. He just wanted to go home, crawl into bed, and sleep for a week. He wanted to wake up and find out this was all a bad dream. But he couldn't. He was a host. He was a son. People filed in, their eyes red and puffy. They hugged him, patted his back, and told him how sorry they were. They told him stories about his mother, how she had helped a child learn to read, how she had donated to the food bank, how she always had a kind word for everyone. It was nice, but it was also exhausting. It felt like they were trying to sum up his mother's entire life in 5-minute conversations, and it just wasn't enough. She was too big for this small room. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted. David looked up. The people coming down the stairs had stopped chatting. They were whispering, nudging each other, their eyes wide. The crowd at the bottom of the stairs parted, creating a clear path. Keanu walked in. He had taken off his suit jacket. He was wearing just a white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing his forearms. His tie was loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked less like a celebrity and more like a tired man who had just finished a long shift at work. He was carrying his helmet in one hand, tucking it under his arm like a football. The silence that followed him was deafening. For a second, nobody moved. Everyone just stared. It was a classic deer in headlights look. They were starstruck. They were stunned. Keanu stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked around the room. He didn't seem bothered by the staring. He just seemed to be taking it all in. The folding tables with their plastic tablecloths, the buffet lined with the steaming trays of food, the punch bowls sitting on a lace doily. He spotted David near the door. He didn't wave or try to draw attention to himself. He just gave a small, barely perceptible nod. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He walked over to the table where the name tags were sitting. He picked up a marker, scribbled something on a sticker, and slapped it on his chest. He walked past the groups of whispering people and headed straight for the buffet table. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who lived downstairs, was standing near the ham, holding a plate with a slice of pineapple on it. She looked like she might faint as Keanu approached her. "Excuse me," Keanu said softly, reaching for a paper plate. "Is this the line?" Mrs. Gable blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Yes. No. Go ahead." "Thank you," he said politely. He started serving himself. He took a spoonful of potato salad. He took a slice of ham. He took a roll. He moved slowly, carefully, like he did this every day. He didn't act like he was slumming it. He acted like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. David watched, mesmerized. He saw Keanu hesitate over the sandwiches. There was a platter of ham and cheese sandwiches, cut into neat little triangles. Keanu stared at them for a long moment. He reached out and picked one up. He looked at it, a small, sad smile touching his lips. He took a bite. The room slowly began to buzz again, but it was a different kind of buzz. It wasn't the hushed whispers of shock anymore. It was the sound of people realizing that Keanu was just a person. He was eating the potato salad. He was drinking the punch. He was standing in line like everyone else. David saw a few people pull out their phones, trying to be sneaky about taking pictures. Keanu noticed, but he didn't say anything. He just turned his body slightly, shielding his plate, and kept eating. He wasn't there to be a spectacle. He was there to be a guest. After he filled his plate, Keanu didn't go to an empty table in the corner to hide. He walked over to a table where some of the older residents of the neighborhood were sitting. These were people who had known Eleanor for decades. They were in their 70s and 80s, wearing their Sunday best. "Is this seat taken?" Keanu asked, pointing to an empty chair next to Mr. Henderson, the man he had helped with the flowers. Mr. Henderson looked up, his eyes wide. No, sit down, son. Please." Keanu sat down. He didn't dominate the conversation. He didn't talk about movies or Hollywood. He leaned in and started talking to them about Eleanor. I heard she used to organize the summer picnics, Keanu said, taking a bite of his roll. The old woman across from him, Mrs. Albright, nodded eagerly. Oh, yes. She planned the whole thing every year. She made the best potato salad. Although, she lowered her voice, glanced at the buffet table, I think this year's is a little dry. Keanu chuckled. It was a genuine, warm sound. I won't tell, he whispered. The table erupted in laughter. The tension broke. Suddenly, he wasn't Keanu Reeves, movie star. He was just Keanu, the nice young man who came to pay his respects. They started telling him stories. They told him about the time Eleanor got locked in the library during a snowstorm. They told him about her terrible singing voice in the church choir. David watched from across the room. He felt a lump in his throat. But this time it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. Keanu wasn't just showing up. He was participating. He was sharing the grief. He was letting these old people tell their stories, making them feel heard. He was giving them a moment of joy on a very sad day. After he finished eating, Keanu stood up. He cleared his own plate, throwing away the trash and stacking the plastic fork in the bin. He walked over to David. Is there somewhere we can talk? Keanu asked quietly. Just for a minute. David nodded. We can go outside. To the garden. They walked out the back door into a small courtyard. It was a memorial garden with a few benches and a small fountain. The noise of the reception faded away, replaced by the sound of the water trickling and the distant hum of traffic. The air was getting cooler as the afternoon turned into evening. The sky was a bruised purple and orange, the colors of a sunset that was almost over. They sat on a bench. Keanu sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking at the fountain. He looked tired. The weight of the day seemed to be settling on his shoulders. I wanted to give you something, Keanu said, but I realized I gave the book back already. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old and soft, like it had been unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. This is a letter, Keanu said. Your mom wrote it to me years ago, after my daughter passed away. David froze. He knew about Keanu's tragic past. Everyone did. But he didn't know his mother had reached out. I was in a dark place, Keanu continued, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to talk to anyone. But Eleanor found out. She sent this letter to my agent. It took months to get to me. He handed the paper to David. I want you to have it. It's yours now. It belongs with her things. David unfolded the paper. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It was his mother's looping, gentle scrawl. Dear Keanu, it read. Asterisk, I heard the news. I am so sorry. I know there are no words that can fix a hole that big, but I want you to know that love doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. It becomes the air you breathe. It becomes the strength in your bones. You will carry her forever. And that is a heavy burden, but it is also a beautiful one. You are not alone. Asterisk. David's eyes blurred with tears. He looked up at Keanu. She saved me then, too, Keanu said softly. She had a way of doing that. Sending a letter when you needed it most. She never threw anything away, David said, his voice cracking. She kept everything. But I didn't know she wrote to you about that. Keanu nodded. She was a healer. She didn't need medicine. She just needed a pen and a piece of paper and a heart that was bigger than the world. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the water in the fountain. It was a peaceful silence. It was a silence of two people who understood each other perfectly. I have to go, Keanu said finally. Standing up, he stretched his back, wincing slightly. I have a flight tonight. Thank you, David said, standing up too. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the eulogy. Thank you for everything. Keanu reached out and shook David's hand. But then he pulled him into a hug. It was a strong, tight hug. He patted David's back firmly. Take care of yourself, David, Keanu whispered in his ear. And remember what I said. Carry her, but let others help you with the weight. He pulled back and put on his helmet. He didn't look back as he walked toward his motorcycle parked around the corner. David stood in the garden, holding the letter in his hand. He heard the engine roar to life. He heard the bike roar off into the distance. fading away into the sound of the city. He stood there for a long time, reading the letter over and over again. He thought about the sandwiches. He thought about the couch. He thought about the empty chair that wasn't empty anymore. He walked back inside the reception hall. The room was still full of people. The hum of conversation was louder now. People were laughing. They were telling stories. They were eating the dry potato salad and the ham sandwiches. David walked over to the buffet table. He picked up a ham sandwich. He took a bite. It tasted like bread and ham and memories. He looked around the room. He saw Mrs. Albright showing a picture on her phone to her friends, probably a sneaky photo of Keanu. He saw Mr. Henderson holding court, telling everyone how Keanu had helped him with the flowers. He saw the funeral director looking relieved that everything was over. But mostly, he felt the absence of the heavy weight on his chest. It was still there, the grief, but it felt different now. It felt manageable. He walked over to the table where he had left his jacket. He reached into the pocket and pulled out the small, green leather book. Hamlet. He opened it to the inscription. Asterisk for Keanu. Word have power. Use yours well. Love. Eleanor. Asterisk. He closed the book and held it tight. David. Mrs. Albright called out from across the room. Are you okay, dear? David looked up. He looked at the sea of faces. He looked at the fluorescent lights. He looked at the half-eaten sandwich in his hand. He smiled. It wasn't the polite, fake smile he had been wearing all day. It was a small, genuine smile. Yeah, David said. I'm okay. I think I'm going to be okay. He walked over to join his neighbors. He sat down. He started to tell a story about his mother, a story he hadn't thought of in years, a story about how she used to burn the toast every Sunday morning but pretend it was gourmet style. The room laughed, and for the first time since she got sick, David laughed too, and somewhere, on a plane high above the clouds or on a highway riding into the night, Keanu was carrying the memory of a librarian who made sandwiches for a hungry boy. The circle was complete. The debt was paid in the only currency that mattered, presence. Eleanor Higgins was gone, but in that room, in the stories, and in the heart of the stranger she had saved, she was very much alive.